Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's Notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil for yet another engaging conversation.
Okay, so today we're going to dive into a really pivotal moment, I think. It's a major turning point in recent history, the end of the Cold War, and how the Soviet Union broke apart.
Yeah, it was a period where everything was changing really fast, and the geopolitical map was being completely redrawn in ways that, honestly, very few people saw coming.
Right, and to try to understand this, we need to kind of step back and put ourselves, in the world of 1991 and think about what was happening. The Soviet Union was definitely having some serious internal problems at that point, though I think the speed of its eventual collapse wasn't totally obvious to everybody back then. But for the United States, which had obviously been in this Cold War rivalry for decades, their main concern was making sure that this whole thing ended in a stable and peaceful way.
Yeah, and you also have to remember the reforms that Gorbachev put into place, the policies of Glasnost and Perestroika. Those aimed to open up Soviet society more and restructure the economy. But what's interesting is that these reforms, while they were meant to make the Soviet system stronger, actually ended up creating an environment where nationalist sentiments, which had been there kind of under the surface for a long time, were suddenly able to come out into the open. And they started to gain real momentum across those different Soviet republics.
And we really saw this play out in Ukraine. In March of '91, they had a referendum on sovereignty, and an overwhelming majority of Ukrainians voted in favor of it.
Right.
And they were getting ready for another referendum in December of that year, this time on full independence. Then, of course, you have the failed coup against Gorbachev in August of '91, and that really just threw more fuel on the fire for the whole independence movement.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. That failed coup was a really clear sign that the central government was losing its grip. It emboldened the republics, and they started to push even harder for their own sovereignty.
So it's in this kind of crazy dynamic setting that we get to this very important event. On August 1, 1991, U.S. President George H.W. Bush gave a speech to the Ukrainian parliament in Kiev. This speech, well, let's just say it became pretty well known. Maybe even infamous would be the right word. People started calling it the Chicken Kiev Speech. And a lot of that came from the pretty sharp criticism it got afterward.
Right, right.
And that's exactly what we're going to try to dig into today. We really want to get to the bottom of what this speech was all about, its main messages, the specific context in which it was given, and how it reflected this idea of strategic conservatism that was really guiding a lot of American thinking at the time.
Exactly. So our aim here is to kind of unpack all of that, the ins and outs of U.S. foreign policy during this period of, just really intense change, how the U.S. dealt with Ukraine's push for independence. And of course, this whole idea of strategic conservatism, which was a pretty big deal in Washington at the time.
Okay, so to start, let's zoom in on the geopolitical landscape of 1991. As we've said, the Soviet Union was definitely on its way down, and it was happening faster than a lot of people thought it would. Even now, looking back, it's easy to forget just how unexpectedly fast it all fell apart. There were definitely signs that things were tense inside the USSR, but the actual speed of the collapse caught many people off guard.
And it's interesting because those reforms that Gorbachev started, the Glasnost and Perestroika, while they were supposed to be about bringing positive changes to the Soviet system, they kind of backfired in a way. They ended up giving these nationalist sentiments a way to resurface and gain a real foothold. Think about it, Glasnost. By pushing for more freedom of speech and openness in public discourse, it accidentally created a platform for these national identities and aspirations that had been suppressed for, literally decades. And they suddenly had this opportunity to come back with a vengeance and gain a ton of support across the Soviet republics.
And Ukraine was a perfect example of this. That vote in March of '91, where they voted overwhelmingly for sovereignty, was like a huge signal. It was obvious they wanted more control over their own destiny. And then, as you said, that whole push for the December independence referendum just kept gaining more and more momentum.
Yeah, that March referendum really said it all. That huge majority voting for sovereignty, it sent a super clear message about where Ukraine was headed.
Right.
And then when the coup failed in August, it just added more fuel to that fire. They were definitely moving toward independence.
So now looking at things from the U.S. perspective at the time, it's pretty clear their top priority was to end the Cold War, but to end it in a stable, peaceful way. And they saw Gorbachev as a key player in making that happen.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You have to remember this was after decades of this super intense Cold War rivalry. So the U.S. was really focused on ensuring that they moved away from that whole era in a way that was smooth and, most importantly, peaceful. They saw Gorbachev as this crucial figure. He was the one who started these big reforms within the Soviet Union, and he had been involved in some pretty crucial arms control talks with the U.S.
Right.
Maintaining that relationship with him was absolutely essential for the U.S.
And because of that, because they were so focused on keeping that relationship with Gorbachev strong, they were pretty hesitant to openly support these independence movements that were springing up inside the Soviet Union. They were worried, understandably so, about possibly making the situation less stable, risking ethnic conflicts breaking out, or, as President Bush himself put it, the danger of suicidal nationalism.
And that hesitation came from a genuine concern about what might happen, the unintended consequences. The U.S. government was really worried that if they came out strongly in favor of these independence movements, it could destabilize the entire Soviet Union.
Right.
And that could lead to, well, who knows what, maybe widespread ethnic violence, even problems with controlling the Soviet Union's nuclear arsenal, which was a terrifying thought. That phrase, suicidal nationalism, it really reflects their anxiety about extreme nationalism leading to internal conflict and basically making the whole region really unstable.
So it sounds like the main approach within the U.S. government was to encourage democratic and economic reforms, but to do it within the existing structure of the Soviet Union. Like they were hoping for a gradual, controlled evolution rather than a sudden, explosive breakup.
That's pretty much it. They definitely preferred a more managed, orderly transition. They thought the thinking in Washington was that if they supported reforms within the existing system under Gorbachev's leadership, they could get to a more open and democratic system in a predictable, stable way. They wouldn't have to deal with all the crazy unknowns that might come with a bunch of new independent states suddenly appearing. And this really gets to the heart of that strategic conservatism we're talking about, where you basically prioritize stability and what you know rather than taking the risk of some kind of radical, unpredictable change.
Meanwhile, over in Ukraine itself, we've already talked about how there was this huge surge of national pride and a really strong desire for independence. And a lot of this came from, well, centuries of being controlled by different empires and a growing sense of what it meant to be Ukrainian.
Yeah, when you look at Ukraine's history, it's full of these periods where they were under someone else's thumb. They were always fighting for self-determination. And that memory, those historical experiences played a big part in shaping that strong push for independence in 91, this growing sense of national identity. It was really powerful. It was driving the whole movement towards sovereignty.
And the Ukrainian parliament, the Verkhovna Rada, they were becoming more and more autonomous in how they acted. They were really asserting their own authority, making their own decisions.
Yeah, that's a really important point. The Verkhovna Rada becoming more assertive, that really shows you how much the political landscape was changing inside Ukraine. They weren't just acting like some regional body under the Soviet system anymore. They were actively trying to grab more control, pushing for more and more autonomy.
And then you have these prominent leaders emerging, like Leonid Kravchuk. He was very outspoken, actively arguing for a completely independent Ukraine, completely separate from the Soviet Union.
Oh yeah, Kravchuk was a central figure in all of this. He really articulated and championed that vision of an independent Ukrainian state, totally free from Soviet control. And his strong advocacy, it really reflected a growing feeling within Ukrainian society that self-determination was the only way forward.
So you have this fundamental difference in perspective. The U.S. basically wanting a reformed Soviet Union, and Ukraine being more and more determined to become totally independent. That's where things start to get a little tense, right?
Absolutely. That's where the real friction starts. You see, while the U.S. often talked about the idea of national self-determination, in principle, the practical realities of trying to manage the end of the Cold War made them really prioritize their relationship with Gorbachev and this idea of a reformed Soviet Union. Specifically, they were concerned about stability and what might happen with the Soviet nuclear weapons if things went haywire. And this put them in a bit of an awkward spot because it really clashed with what the Ukrainian people wanted, which was full independence right then and there.
Right. So with all of that in mind, all that important background, let's actually look at the Chicken Kiev speech itself and try to figure out some of its key themes. One of the most famous, or maybe infamous, lines for the speech is when President Bush very clearly states, "Freedom is not the same as independence." Let's try to unpack that a bit. What do you think he meant by that?
That line, it's really the core of what the U.S.'s position was at that time. By saying freedom is not the same as independence, President Bush was essentially arguing that Ukraine could actually gain more freedoms like a democratic government, a free economy, and the rule of law while still being part of a reformed Soviet Union. They didn't necessarily have to go for complete independence, he was suggesting.
Right.
At that point, the U.S. really thought it was more important to focus on internal reforms that would guarantee those basic freedoms rather than breaking up the Soviet Union, which could lead to all sorts of problems.
So they were basically saying they were open to supporting efforts to promote freedom and democracy, both within the Central Soviet government and in the individual republics, right?
Exactly. In his speech, President Bush made it very clear that the U.S. were willing to back individuals and movements that were fighting for freedom, democracy, and economic liberty. And it didn't matter if those people were in Moscow or in any of the republics that made up the Soviet Union. This was all tied to the U.S.'s support for the reforms that Gorbachev had started, like glasnost, perestroika, and democratization. They saw those as positive steps in the right direction.
And President Bush specifically mentioned the 9+1 agreement in his speech. Can you explain what that was all about and why it was important in this context?
Sure. The 9+1 agreement was basically Gorbachev's attempt, along with the leaders of 9 of the Soviet republics, to create a new union treaty. The idea behind this treaty was to decentralize power within the Soviet Union. The republics would get more autonomy, but they'd still be part of the overall Soviet state. Now, the fact that President Bush specifically endorsed this agreement in his Chicken Kiev speech, it really highlights that the U.S. preferred this kind of negotiated, gradual devolution of power, with Gorbachev still at the helm rather than the Soviet Union just totally breaking apart into a bunch of independent states. They saw it as a safer, more predictable way to achieve greater freedoms and reforms.
Now, another really important part of the Chicken Kiev speech is when President Bush gives these really strong warnings against what he called suicidal nationalism and the possibility of replacing a far-off tyranny with a local despotism. What was the U.S. government so worried about that led to these warnings?
Those warnings, they really show you how anxious the Bush administration was about what might happen if the Soviet Union actually collapsed. They were especially worried about the potential for massive ethnic violence. You have to remember, the Soviet Union was made up of all these different ethnic groups, and if the central government suddenly lost control, well, things could get really ugly really fast. And they were also really worried about the possibility of new dictatorships popping up in these newly independent states. Imagine, you fight to get rid of one oppressive regime, and then a new one just takes its place.
Right.
These fears about instability and dictatorships taking over, that's why that part of the speech has such a cautionary tone.
So it seems like the U.S. was trying to walk this really fine line in its message to Ukraine. President Bush didn't come out and say he supported independence, but he did acknowledge Ukraine's long history and what he called their experiment in building an open society.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. He was trying to balance things very carefully. While he didn't say he was pro-independence, he did recognize that Ukraine was important, historically speaking, and that they were having these internal debates about freedom, self-rule, and free markets. But he also mixed those acknowledgments with warnings about the dangers of nationalism and made it clear that the U.S. preferred reform within the existing Soviet system. It was a pretty nuanced message, for sure. But the bottom line was that the U.S. wasn't ready to back full independence for Ukraine at that point. They were being very cautious.
So knowing all of that, how did people react to this speech, both within Ukraine and back in the U.S.? Because it sounds like it caused quite a stir.
Oh, it definitely did. It's interesting, though, because the initial reaction in the Ukrainian parliament, the Verkhovna Rada, was actually pretty positive. Some reports even said that they gave President Bush a standing ovation after he finished speaking.
Really?
Yeah, but this initial positive reaction in the parliament, it didn't really reflect what a lot of people in Ukraine as a whole were thinking, especially those who were involved in the pro-independence movement.
Right.
Those groups were not happy.
Yeah, we know that some prominent figures in the Ukrainian independence movement, like Ivan Drak from RUK, they were very critical of the speech. They felt like President Bush was way too focused on keeping Gorbachev happy and wasn't paying enough attention to the democratic movements and the people in Ukraine who were clearly demanding independence.
Yeah, that quote from Drak about President Bush being hypnotized by Gorbachev, that really captures the frustration and disappointment that a lot of people in the Ukrainian nationalist movement felt. They believed the U.S. was just ignoring how strong these independence movements were becoming, not just in Ukraine, but across the whole Soviet Union. Stepan Pavluk was another one who was critical. He said that for Ukraine, freedom and independence were basically two sides of the same crane. He thought President Bush's idea that they were separate was just totally missing the point of what Ukrainians were fighting for.
And it wasn't just the political leaders in the independence movement who reacted negatively. There were reports of public protests in Kiev, too, where people were holding signs and chanting slogans, making it very clear that they wanted full independence and they wanted it now.
Exactly. These public protests really showed how big the gap was becoming between what the U.S. wanted, a reformed Soviet Union under Gorbachev, and what a lot of Ukrainians were demanding, which was complete, immediate independence.
And then back in the U.S., the Chicken Kiev speech also got a lot of pushback. And this is where that nickname really stuck, thanks to a scathing column by William Solfire in the New York Times.
Oh, yeah, Sapphire's piece in the Times was a big deal. It really had a lasting impact on how people viewed the speech. That's where the name Chicken Kiev really came from. He called it a colossal misjudgment. And he was really harsh in his criticism. He said President Bush sounded anti-liberty and that the speech could actually damage the future relationship between the U.S. and an independent Ukraine.
Wow.
He didn't hold back at all.
And it wasn't just Sapphire. Other newspapers jumped on board, too. The Boston Globe, for instance, they ran a pretty critical editorial. They even coined this phrase, Bush League in Kiev, to describe the whole thing. And they specifically criticized the language President Bush used, things like suicidal nationalism.
Yeah, the Boston Globe's criticism was all about how they thought President Bush was taking sides in what they saw as Ukraine's internal debate. And they thought his language was too harsh, too insensitive, especially that term suicidal nationalism. A lot of people felt like that was just dismissing legitimate Ukrainian desires for self-determination.
Right.
And there was a growing feeling among some commentators in the U.S. that the whole speech was just totally tone-deaf, like it wasn't in tune with how quickly things were changing inside the Soviet Union.
It seems like a lot of people, both in Ukraine and in the U.S., thought President Bush was hanging on to this idea of a reformed Soviet Union, even though it was becoming more and more obvious that it was about to collapse completely.
Yeah, and when you look back on it now with the advantage of hindsight, you can really see that the U.S. missed the mark. A good example of this is that piece The Economist published in '92, which basically argued that the U.S., through that Chicken Kiev speech, failed to see how inevitable Ukrainian independence was. It's kind of ironic, because the speech almost became the symbol of a miscalculation by the U.S. government.
So now let's move on to how academics and historians have interpreted this really important speech. It seems like this idea of strategic conservatism in U.S. foreign policy comes up a lot in these analogies.
It does. A lot of times when academics talk about the Chicken Kiev speech, they see it as a classic example of the Bush administration's strategic conservatism. They argue that the administration was really focused on stability and predictability in international relations. They were especially cautious when dealing with a major nuclear power like the Soviet Union, which was going through some pretty major internal turmoil. And they felt like it was absolutely essential to keep a good relationship with Gorbachev because he was a known quantity. They could work with him.
So basically, this strategic conservatism meant that the U.S. wanted to keep the Soviet Union stable, even if that meant not giving their full support to those independence movements that were gaining steam in the republics.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Scholars who look at this speech from that strategic conservatism perspective, they emphasize how worried the U.S. was about what might happen if the Soviet Union just suddenly fell apart. They were worried about widespread instability, nuclear weapons getting into the wrong hands, and regional conflicts breaking out. And the way President Bush talked in the speech, the warnings about nationalism and dictatorships, that directly reflects those fears. The U.S. government was really focused on making sure that the Soviet Union's huge nuclear arsenal was kept secure and eventually dismantled safely.
But there were also some academics who argued that by taking this cautious approach, the U.S. actually blew a chance to really get behind Ukrainian self-determination.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Critics of the strategic conservatism approach, both back then and now, they've said that the Chicken Kiev speech shows how the U.S. missed an opportunity to stand with the people of Ukraine and other independence movements in the Soviet Union who were fighting for democracy. These critics say the Bush administration put too much faith in Gorbachev's ability to hold the Soviet Union together, and at the same time, they underestimated how strong and determined those independence movements really were.
And looking back now, knowing how everything played out, some historians even say that the cautious stance the U.S. took at that time might have actually hurt the early relationship between the U.S. and an independent Ukraine.
It's an interesting point, and it comes up a lot in analyses of this period. That initial disappointment, maybe even resentment that Ukrainians felt toward the U.S. because of the Chicken Kiev speech, it probably did complicate things and maybe even created some underlying tensions in the relationship between the U.S. and Ukraine in the years right after Ukraine declared independence. The speech definitely casts a long shadow, and people still debate about its legacy.
It's fascinating when you think about everything that's happened since then. It really makes you wonder, how much should foreign policy focus on maintaining stability in the short term versus actively supporting those democratic movements in other countries? And what are the long-term consequences of each approach, especially in a world that's constantly changing so much? It's a huge question, and I think it's still relevant as we deal with the challenges in the world today.
It is, and I think this whole period, the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, it gives us a lot to think about. It shows us just how complex international relations can be. And the Chicken Kiev speech, it's right at the center of those complexities.
Well, thank you so much for walking us through all of this. It's been a really enlightening look at a fascinating and important historical moment.
Thanks for having me. It's a period in history that continues to offer valuable insights into the complexities of global politics.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.